The foremost candidates for power in either city, Plostyanax, son of Pausanias, king of Sparta, and Nicias, son of Niceratus, the most fortunate general of his time, each desired peace more ardently than ever. Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 91, The Peace of Nicias. In the wake of the campaigns of 424, we have seen that both Athens and Sparta were seeking a pause in the war, with what it would seem, the possibility for a lasting peace. Athens had some successes early in the year, but would suffer setbacks as they tried to push their advantage, while Sparta had been what it seemed like a hopeless position, but then encouraged by a turnaround in fortune of the Athenians. This would end up leading to a truce being signed that was to last 1 year, while the hope from factions within each city-state would be that a longer-lasting peace would be negotiated. However, this peace, along with the truce itself, were placed in jeopardy, with operations taking place in Thrace with the Spartan general Brasidas. He had commenced operations when Athens was beginning to see a reversal in their fortunes, where he would target the possessions of the Athenians in the resource-rich region of Thrace. His unorthodox approach for a Spartan would see many cities revolt from Athens and open their gates to him. However, the truce now risked halting the momentum he had built up. Brasidas would ignore the terms of the truce and continue operations, citing timing issues as a defence. However, it appears all, including the Spartans, that his actions had breached the truce. Athens would now send a force to counter Brasidas, while Sparta would send government representatives to ensure proceedings were being carried out under government interests, while almost certainly trying to capitalise on Brasidas' success. Athens had sent forces into Thrace that began countering Spartan efforts in 423, but they would end up becoming tied down with the siege of Sicone. With the spring of 422, another fleet would be sent from Athens, with the Athenian general Cleon in command. He had managed to convince the assembly, who appear to have become more enraged at Sparta's actions, to increase Athens' commitment in the region, to regaining their possessions and defeating the Spartans. Cleon's ultimate goal was to recapture Amphipolis, the most important Athenian possession in Thrace. Cleon's campaign would begin well with some early victories, though, once at Eion, and now opposed by Brasidas and Amphipolis, he would become more cautious. Before being able to gather enough troops to encircle the city and place it under siege, Cleon would be challenged by Brasidas as he moved forward with what would appear to be a core element of his force. Brasidas would make it appear he was readying to move against the Athenian force, observing the city. This would force Cleon to withdraw, thinking he was not strong enough to fight a battle in the field. However, this withdrawal would make his force vulnerable, and Brasidas would take advantage of this, engaging the Athenians from two directions as they sallied out of the walls. The battle that developed would end up seeing the death of both Brasidas and Cleon, and would see the Athenian element that had been defeated sail back for Athens once reaching Eion in disorder. Although Sparta had retained Amphipolis, they were in a position where continued operations were becoming more difficult. They were unable to march any reinforcements into Thrace, due to Thessaly being hostile, while Athens still posed a threat to their garrisons in Thrace. We also need to remember that Athens still had over 120 Spartiates in captivity, and Sparta had no fleet to speak of. This would see that more within the Spartan government were becoming motivated to seek a peace, while Athens, on the other hand, although in a stronger position than Sparta, when viewed on paper, they had a number of factors seeing that peace was becoming more desirable, with its seeming war weariness from its citizens becoming one of the biggest factors in seeing more in the assembly wanting negotiations to begin with Sparta. However, although negotiations would begin to take place over the winter, a resolution would not come about right away. As we finished off with last episode, although we could see the desire for a negotiated peace to come about between the two was becoming more favourable in both cities, the talks taking place in the wake of Amphipolis had yet come to a resolution. Heading into 421, both sides would continue with their war footing, as to continue hostilities into a new campaigning season. In the background, the Athenian figure of Nicias, who the peace would be named after, due to the central role he would play, would engage with the Spartan king Plostyanax in an attempt to bring about terms acceptable to both sides. As we have seen over the past couple of years, this kind of negotiating had been taking place, but had netted nil results thus far. But with both sides appearing to be more motivated for peace, these talks would finally get somewhere this time around. Thucydides also highlights that this point in time, after what both sides had gone through, and the political situation in both Athens and Sparta, Both were now in a position where the peace factions were at their height of influence. Nicias, as we had seen, had risen to be the leading figure of those Athenian politicians seeking a peaceful resolution. He was now in a perfect position to convince his fellow citizens this was the right path forward. He had obtained a level of military respect higher than anyone else of his time, with Thucydides telling us he wished to use this to advancing his agenda. Thucydides would point out Nicias also had personal motivations to seeking a peace established, where it seems he tries to show that although Nicias had virtue and was looking out for Athens' interests, he also brings him down a peg, as in Thucydides' opinion, he doesn't measure up to the standards set by Pericles. He would write, Nicias wished to rest upon his laurels, to find an immediate release from the toil and trouble for both himself and for his fellow citizens, and to leave behind him the name of one whose service to the state had been successful from start to finish. However, through Plutarch we can also see other attributes that would make him a figure that would eventually win around most Athenians to his line of thinking. In addition to the popularity he had gained from his military experience, he would also earn the respect through his piety by spending generous amounts on religious observations and other services to benefit the Athenian citizens. While he would also be seen as the perfect candidate to continue the attempted negotiations with Sparta, due to the special relationship he had developed with them. He had earned the confidence of the Spartans due to the kindness that he had afforded the Spartan prisoners while held captive in Athens. To Sparta, Nicias may have reminded them of Cimon from a generation earlier. On the other side, seeking peace with Athens, was the Spartan king Plostyanax, who had originally led a Spartan army towards Attica at the end of the First Peloponnesian War. He had been exiled after the army returned home as negotiations between him and Pericles took place, which would see no battle develop. Plostyanax was accused of accepting bribes from Pericles, and would end up being exiled in 445. In 427, Plostyanax had been recalled from exile after the death of Archidamus, though his enemies within Sparta would accuse him of bribing the Pythia at Delphi to convince the Spartans to have him recalled and placed back in power. While back as one of the Spartan kings, his enemies would continue to lean into this charge, with them bringing it up whenever anything went wrong in Sparta, insinuating Apollo was punishing Sparta for Plostyanax's disrespect of him. Thucydides would present Plostyanax's distress at being continually levelled with these charges as his motivations to seeking peace. He would write, he thought that in peacetime disasters would not occur. Also that, once the Spartans got back their prisoners, his enemies would have no basis from which to attack him. Whereas during a state of war, those in the highest positions must necessarily get blamed for every misfortune that took place. He was therefore extremely anxious to come to terms with Athens. However, although this might have had some bearing on him wanting to see peace established, it is also clear that Plostyanax had been in favour of peace with Athens from as far back as the First Peloponnesian War. His exile was in reaction to the truce he worked out with Pericles while on the march. While when we hear about the peace party in Sparta, he is often associated with it. Like Nicias, he was also seen as the best conduit to negotiations, as he had been on friendly terms with certain Athenian families. However, as we touched on at the end of last episode, although negotiations were taking place, no agreement had come about, as the campaigning season of 421 arrived. What's interesting for this year is that we are told that Sparta was preparing to invade Attica for the first time since 424. Previously, the Spartans had avoided their yearly invasion due to the Athenians holding over 120 Spartiates hostage. The fear had been that if they had attempted to march into Athenian territory, these men would be executed. So why had Sparta decided that they now would take the risk? Firstly, we need to wonder if the Spartans were serious about actually setting foot on Attic soil. Thucydides tells us that during the spring, orders were sent out from Sparta to all the other Peloponnesian members to ready their forces and materials for the establishment of forts within the Athenian territory. After telling us this, he then adds that this was done in order for the Athenians to be more inclined to accept the terms that had been offered in the negotiations so far. Here we can see Thucydides insinuating that the Spartans didn't have the intention of launching this invasion, but rather were looking to create a climate of fear within Athens that would see peace talks advance and an agreement reached. Though it is possible that Sparta might have still invaded if negotiations still continued. Perhaps they were ready to call Athens' bluff, If they did execute the Spartiates, they would have gotten rid of their bargaining chip when it came to hostilities and for when negotiations did advance. However, the Peloponnesians would not need to set foot in Attica, as it seems word of the preparations that were being made had convinced the assembly in Athens to agree on terms to see a peace put in place. It would appear that an initial agreement took place that would see hostilities halted and then allow for the full terms of the peace to be reached. Claims would be going back and forward, but finally an agreement would come about. The continuation of peace talks now rested on both sides agreeing to give back all the possessions that had been acquired by each during the years of the war. Though Athens was to still hold on to Nicaea, the port near Megara. The reasoning for this concession was due to Thebes having successfully argued that they had not taken Plataea by force, but due to an agreement reached with those of the city freely. Athens then, in turn, highlighted that this had been the same situation with their control of Nicaea. With this initial understanding in place, Sparta then called for a meeting of all the Peloponnesian members to gain a vote of those who were in favour of peace and would continue to be involved in the terms. However, the Boeotians, Corinthians, and Megarians would not be in favour of peace, as they would lose out in the current agreement, which saw areas they had interest in or had previously controlled remaining with Athens. However, these objections to the peace negotiations to take place with Athens would not stop Sparta from engaging in the agreement. As we have seen, Sparta was at the head of the Peloponnesian League and did not need a majority vote to proceed with how they wished. Though it seems it was only a few of the Peloponnesian members who were opposed. These, however, were some of Sparta's most important allies, and as we will see down the track, some would find reason to oppose Sparta, with their opposition being ignored. In the meantime, a peace would be signed after the initial agreement that had seen a halt to hostilities. As the title of this episode suggests, the peace that would be signed would be known as the Peace of Nicias. One of the central provisions of the Peace of Nicias was the return of captives and prisoners of war. During the conflict, both Athens and Sparta had taken numerous prisoners from one another's forces. These prisoners were a constant source of tension, and both sides sought to pressure the other with a threat of execution or enslavement. Under the terms of the treaty, both Athens and Sparta agreed to return these captives, signalling a commitment to end the cycle of personal retribution that had characterised the war so far. This provision was not just about humanitarian concerns, it was also a way to demonstrate goodwill and pave the way for future cooperation. However, while the treaty stipulated the return of prisoners, its enforcement was not straightforward. Many prisoners had been kept in harsh conditions, and the logistics of returning large numbers of captives posed challenges. Even so, the agreement marked an important gesture of reconciliation, and it was one of the more visible aspects of the peace, signalling an attempt to re-establish trust between the two warring states. Additionally, the treaty required both sides to return any captured land or possessions that had been taken during the course of the war. This provision was meant to restore the territorial status quo and ensure that neither side gained permanent advantages in the terms of land or resources. In theory, this would allow the two powers to return to their pre-war positions with no lasting territorial gains or losses. However, as was often the case in the Peloponnesian War, the actual implementation of such clauses was fraught with difficulty, particularly given the complex web of alliances and the political significance of certain territories. Another crucial aspect of the Peace of Nicias was the restoration of alliances. Both Athens and Sparta had formed powerful alliances during the war, with Athens leading the Delian League and Sparta heading the Peloponnesian League. The treaty required both sides to restore their alliances to their pre-war configurations, meaning that each city-state would return to its position of leadership within the respective alliance network. For Athens, this meant reasserting control over the cities and islands of the Delian League, many of which had experienced varying levels of autonomy during the conflict. For Sparta, it meant reaffirming its influence over the Peloponnesian League, including cities like Corinth and Thebes. However, this restoration of alliances was problematic in practice because the agreement did not include the allies of either side in the formal treaty negotiations. The smaller city-states, which had been dragged into the war due to their obligations to either Athens or Sparta, were not fully consulted on their peace terms. As a result, some of these allies were dissatisfied with the peace and were unwilling to fully comply with the treaty. For example, many of Sparta's allies, especially Corinth and Thebes, were dissatisfied with the treaty and were unwilling to follow its terms. Corinth in particular had long opposed Athens and was not willing to accept the renewed status quo. These states did not participate directly in the treaty negotiations, and their opposition to the peace led to continued hostilities in some regions. Athens faced similar challenges with its own allies, many of whom resented the power dynamics within the Delian League and were not fully content with the terms of the peace. Consequently, while the peace called for the restoration of alliances, the dissatisfaction of many of these allies made it difficult to maintain the peace in practice. A symbolic yet important provision of the Peace of Nicias was the agreement to dismantle fortifications. Both Athens and Sparta had built significant fortifications during the course of the war, particularly Athens, whose long walls connected the city to its port, the Piraeus. These fortifications were seen as critical military assets and symbols of the respective city-state strategic military power. The treaty called for both sides to dismantle these fortifications, which was intended to reduce the risk of further military aggression. The idea was to limit the ability of each side to mobilise forces quickly and to lessen the potential of future conflicts. However, this provision was frequently circumvented in practice. Athens, for instance, was reluctant to dismantle the long walls, which provided vital protection for the city and its maritime interests. Similarly, Sparta was unlikely to dismantle its military infrastructure, given its military ethos and reliance on fortified positions. While the clause about fortifications was a meaningful symbol of peace, its actual impact was limited. Both sides continued to maintain significant military strength, and the dismantling of fortifications was not either fully executed or not a significant enough concession to alter the balance of power in the Greek world. As a result, this article of the treaty was more aspirational than practical. The Peace of Nicias also included provisions regarding the neutrality of certain regions, particularly areas that were strategically significant to both Athens and Sparta. One of the most notable examples of this was the island of Melos, which was designated a neutral zone under the treaty. The idea was that such neutral zones would prevent further conflict in areas that were not directly involved in the rivalry between the two superpowers. Melos, in particular, had been a point of contention during the war, and the designation of the island as neutral was intended to protect it from future aggression. However, the establishment of neutral zones was a difficult concept to enforce. Both Athens and Sparta had imperial ambitions and saw these regions not as neutral, but as potential areas for future expansion. In practice, neutrality was hard to maintain, especially when one side or the other saw an opportunity to gain a strategic advantage. Despite the intention behind the neutral zones, this clause did little to prevent conflict in key areas. The situation in Melos, for instance, would later escalate in 416 BC, when Athens forcibly subjugated the island during the Melian dialogue. This event highlighted the difficulty in enforcing neutrality, especially when the military objectives of the powers involved conflicted with such provisions. The most important provision of the Peace of Nicias, however, was the promise of non-aggression between Athens and Sparta. Both sides agreed to refrain from attacking one another for a period of 50 years, a gesture that was meant to provide long-term stability and security in the Greek world. This promise of peace, if upheld, could have brought about a significant reduction in military conflict, allowing both Athens and Sparta to rebuild their economies after the years of warfare. So as we can see, there are a number of provisions within this agreement that were supposed to have seen both Athens and Sparta satisfied and content with the end of hostilities. However, there were a number of issues that existed and limitations within the peace that would not hold for the period of time intended. One of the most significant limitations of the Peace of Nicias was that it was not universally accepted by the allies of both Athens and Sparta. While the treaty on the surface applied to the two main belligerents, it did not bind their respective allies, many of whom had been deeply involved in the conflict and had their own interests. Both Athens and Sparta relied on a complex web of alliances, and the Peace of Nicias failed to address the grievances of these secondary states. In particular, Sparta's allies such as Corinth and Thebes were not entirely satisfied with the terms of the peace. Corinth, a city-state that had been a staunch opponent of Athens throughout the war, did not want to see Athens emerge from the war with any form of legitimacy. Similarly, Thebes, which had been long at odds with Athens, was unwilling to stop its own hostilities. These allies were not bound by the treaty and saw no reason to cease their ongoing campaigns against Athens. As a result, while Athens and Sparta agreed to peace, the broader Greek world was not unified in its acceptance, and hostilities continued on the periphery. Athens too had to contend with its own allies. The peace treaty which restored the status quo, pre-war, did not address the desires of Athens' subject states, particularly those in the Delian League. Some of these allies were unhappy with Athens' dominance and the tribute they were forced to pay. They viewed the peace as a temporary measure rather than a solution to the power imbalances in the Greek world. In essence, the failure to secure the cooperation of all the relevant parties meant that the peace was fragile and incomplete from the start. Another major flaw of the Peace of Nicias was that it failed to address the root cause of the Peloponnesian War. At its core, the war had been driven by the rivalry between Athens and Sparta, two powerful city-states with fundamentally different political systems, cultures, and visions for the Greek world. Athens, with its democratic government and maritime empire, sought to expand its influence across the Aegean. Sparta, on the other hand, with its oligarchic government and militaristic society, was intent on maintaining the status quo and curbing the power of Athens. The Peace of Nicias merely paused the direct conflict between the two superpowers without addressing this deeper rivalry. It did not resolve the fundamental issues of Athens' growing empire or Sparta's desire to check that growth. The treaty temporarily halted the fighting, but did little to resolve the political and ideological divisions that had fueled the war. Both Athens and Sparta remained suspicious of each other's intentions, and the peace provided no framework for a lasting settlement or reconciliation between the two powers. Moreover, the treaty did not effectively deal with the internal tensions within the Greek world. Many smaller city-states continued to be caught in the crossfire of Athens and Sparta's rivalry. The peace did not dismantle the complex web of alliances and grievances that had developed over the course of the war. As a result, even though the two main belligerents had agreed to a ceasefire, the broader conflict remained unresolved. The peace was merely a temporary halt in the ongoing struggle for dominance between Athens and Sparta, with no guarantee that hostilities would not resume once the opportunity arose. The Peace of Nicias, despite its promises of a prolonged halt in hostilities, did not prevent Athens from pursuing other military ventures. The most significant of these was the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, that we'll be covering in the future. This was a bold and ambitious campaign by Athens to expand its influence in Sicily and the western Mediterranean, aimed at securing new resources and allies. However, the expedition ended in disaster for Athens, with its fleet destroyed and its forces decimated. The Sicilian expedition escalated tensions between Athens and Sparta, leading directly to the resumption of full-scale warfare. Although the Peace of Nicias had been intended to limit military actions between the two powers, Athens' decision to embark on such an ambitious and provocative campaign demonstrated the fragile nature of the peace. The fact that Athens could launch such a large-scale military operation without regard for the treaty's terms underscore how little real commitment there was to lasting peace. The failure of the Sicilian expedition had far-reaching consequences for Athens, weakening its military and economic strength. It also emboldened Sparta and its allies, who saw Athens' defeat as an opportunity to intensify their own military efforts. Ultimately, the resumption of hostilities after the Sicilian failure revealed the weakness of the Peace of Nicias. The agreement had not prevented the war from reigniting, and the political dynamics of the Greek world quickly pushed Athens and Sparta back into conflict. Perhaps the most significant issue with the Peace of Nicias was its lack of effective enforcement mechanisms. While the treaty established a framework for peace, it did not provide any concrete means for ensuring compliance. Neither Athens nor Sparta was bound by any legally enforceable guarantees, and neither side had the will or capacity to hold their allies accountable for violations of the truce. The treaty relied largely on goodwill, which was a weak foundation given the deeply entrenched animosity between the two powers. As both sides slowly rebuilt their military strength during these years of peace, old rivalries and suspicions resurfaced. The lack of any mechanisms to prevent military build-up or aggression meant that both Athens and Sparta could rearm at will. The peace lacked the safeguards that might have made it more durable. Tensions between the two powers remained high, and each side viewed the other's actions with suspicion, making the peace fragile and temporary at best. Furthermore, the treaty did not provide a lasting political settlement or framework for the future diplomacy between Athens and Sparta. There was no comprehensive agreement on the division of influence in the Greek world, and no efforts were made to address the political and military concerns that had initially sparked the conflict. As a result, the peace was always at risk of being undermined by renewed competition for power. Although with many issues and limitations, the Peace of Nicias would be signed in the spring of 421 BC, with Thucydides telling us it was almost to the day, 10 years since the first invasion of Attica. Almost right away, Sparta began implementing articles of the terms set out in the peace. The first action they would take was to release all those that had been taken captive in the war thus far, while Athens would do the same a short time later. The Spartans had also sent envoys to Thrace, where they had the task of relaying the terms and arranging cities to be handed over to Athens. However, resistance to Sparta's orders would develop once they had reached Clearidas and Amphipolis. As we saw last episode, he was the Spartan general who had taken over command after the death of Brasidas. Supposedly, once the terms of the treaty were delivered to all the allies of the Spartans in Thrace, many did not like how they would affect them and refused to accept them. Clearidas had also expressed an opposition to the terms, as he was the commander in the region and did not see how he was supposed to ensure the allies would be forced to accept them. Clearidas would travel back to Sparta to defend his position and wanted to see if the terms of the peace could be altered to create a less tense atmosphere in Thrace. However, the peace had been signed and Sparta was bound by its provisions. Clearidas would be ordered back to Thrace, where he was told to arrange for Amphipolis to be handed over, or at the very least to ensure all Peloponnesians left the city. Also in Sparta around this time were the envoys from many of Sparta's Peloponnesian allies. We had seen that a few had not been in favour of negotiating a peace with Athens. However, now with it signed, they were present to learn of the terms that were now to take effect. Those who had originally been opposed to the talks were not willing to accept the terms that had been signed, unless fairer provisions were made. The Spartans were unable to convince those opposing to come around to the peace, and had no choice but to dismiss the envoys, sending them back to their cities. With a rift developing within the Peloponnesian League, Sparta also now looked to securing their position. If we turn our memories back, we saw that the treaty Sparta had with Argos was due to expire, and this had also played into their fears of dealing with increased hostility on the Peloponnese. So the Spartans had decided their best course of action was to go beyond the peace signed and also establish an alliance with Athens. If this was in effect, then Argos, without Athenian assistance, would not pose a great threat. While with Athens as an ally, many of the Peloponnesians that were unhappy with Sparta would be unlikely to launch any campaign against them. After further talks with Athens, both sides would end up coming to an agreement over an alliance existing between themselves off the back of the Peace of Nicias. At the heart of the alliance was a mutual defence agreement, with both Athens and Sparta committed to coming to each other's aid in the event of an attack. This was a powerful and practical provision, as it secured both city-states from the possibility of external threats. It was particularly significant given the military prowess of both Athens and Sparta, with each having a formidable standing army and navy. By formalising this defence pact, Athens and Sparta sought to create a unified front that would deter other states from taking aggressive actions against them. The alliance extended beyond just Athens and Sparta, as it included provisions for supporting each other's allies. This was an important component of the agreement, as both Athens and Sparta controlled large networks of allies through both their leagues. The alliance ensured that both powers would come to the defence of their allies if they were attacked or threatened. This provision also helped solidify Athens and Sparta's influence over their respective spheres of power, reinforcing their dominance in the Greek world. The alliance also stipulated that Athens and Sparta would cooperate in joint military campaigns when necessary. This clause reflected the pragmatic understanding that, despite their long-standing rivalry, both city-states shared common interests in protecting their dominance over Greece. If a third party posed a threat to either Athens or Sparta, the two powers would combine their military strength to deal with the situation. The prospect of a joint military operation was a sign of the temporary reconciliation between the two, allowing them to act in concert rather than adversaries. With this also looking back to the time of the Persian invasions, where they had both been members of the Hellenic League. A key feature of the alliance was the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of each other's allies. This provision was important for preserving the autonomy of the states within the Athens-Delian League and Sparta's Peloponnesian League. Neither Athens nor Sparta would seek to impose control over the other's allies, or interfere in their internal politics. This was meant to reassure the smaller city-states within their respective spheres that they would not be coerced into supporting interests of the larger powers, thus preserving their independence. The overreaching goal of the alliance was to prevent further aggression and maintain the fragile peace established by the Peace of Nicias. By formalising this pact, Athens and Sparta hoped to signal their commitment to the peace and reduce their chances of resuming hostilities. Given the weariness of both sides after the years of fighting, the alliance was seen as a way to stabilise the region and focus on rebuilding and consolidating power, rather than continuing the costly and destructive war. Having seen the interactions between Athens and Sparta over the generations so far, this sudden switch to entering an alliance probably seems a little out of the ordinary. After the Persian Wars, these two had emerged as the most powerful of the Greek city-states and would clash ideologically as well as militarily for the next almost 60 years. So for both to enter into an alliance through discussions taking place over a couple of months in 421 would have us pause and question how effective this move was going to be in resolving the tensions and history between Athens and Sparta. It's clear the idea was to restore the stability within Greece. However, many fundamental problems would remain, presenting challenges and considerations for a long-lasting alliance. A number of these issues would be similar to the limitations and issues we went through when looking at the Peace of Nicias. Though I still think it is worth looking at the issues of the alliance, since this was negotiated separately and the peace could have still existed without it. One of the most obvious obstacles to the Athenian-Spartan alliance was the deep-rooted mistrust and rivalry between the two city-states. For decades, Athens and Sparta had vied for dominance in the Greek world. Sparta, known for its disciplined and conservative military state, viewed the democratic and ambitious Athenians with suspicion, while Athens saw Sparta's hegemonic stance as a direct threat to its own imperial pursuits. This rivalry was not just political, but deeply ingrained in the culture and ideological values of each state. Years of warfare had fueled animosities, making it difficult for either side to fully trust the other's commitment to peace. Although the Peace of Nicias formally ended hostilities, suspicions lingered, as each side doubted the other's intentions and commitment to the alliance. The strategic objectives of Athens and Sparta were also fundamentally at odds, creating further friction within the alliance. Athens, with its empire based on the Delian League, aimed at expanding its influence across the Aegean and beyond, seeking economic advantage and greater security for its citizens. Meanwhile, Sparta, with its Peloponnesian League, was primarily concerned with curbing Athenian power and maintaining stability within its own sphere of influence. The Peace of Nicias sought to balance these competing goals, but this balance proved precarious. While the treaty brought a temporary respite, it failed to address the deeper ambitions of both states, leaving the underlying competition unresolved. Compounding the strategic friction was the challenge of unreliable allies. Both Athens and Sparta entered the alliance with coalitions of city-states that often had interests at odds with those of their leaders. Sparta's allies, including powerful states like Corinth and Boeotia, expressed long dissatisfaction with the peace and opposed reconciliation with Athens. For these allies, peace with Athens threatened their own security and influence. Athens faced similar pressures, especially from Argos, a historical rival of Sparta. Argos sought Athens' support against Sparta's Peloponnesian League, pressuring the Athenians to pursue a more aggressive stance. This disunity among the allies made it difficult for Athens and Sparta to act decisively in enforcing the terms of the peace, and presented a constant threat to the alliance's stability. Internal political pressures within both Athens and Sparta further weakened the alliance. In Athens, the Peace of Nicias faced opposition from influential leaders who favoured more aggressive policies, most notably Alcibiades. A charismatic and ambitious general, Alcibiades saw the peace as an opportunity for Athens to pursue more adventurous goals, including the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. His faction's influence undermined Nicias' efforts to preserve the peace, and Athens' imperial ambitions soon resurfaced. In Sparta, the situation was likewise strained. Conservative elements within Spartan society doubted the wisdom of aligning with their former enemy and questioned the viability of the peace. These internal divisions, combined with the factions that favoured the return to hostilities, further eroded the alliance from within. The enforcement of the Peace of Nicias itself presented considerable challenges. The treaty stipulated that the return of captured territories and release of prisoners, but not all terms were honoured to each party's satisfaction. Many allies, particularly those associated with Sparta, were reluctant to return conquered lands, or to abandon their allegiances, leading to frequent disputes. This failure to fully comply with the treaty's terms fueled resentment, as both Athens and Sparta felt that the other side was acting in bad faith. The inability to enforce these terms weakened the agreement and fueled ongoing suspicions, making the peace increasingly difficult to sustain. The imperial aspirations of Athens, especially its continued efforts to expand its influence, ultimately pose one of the most significant threats to the alliance. The Peace of Nicias was intended as a framework for maintaining the balances between the two powers. Yet Athens continued to seek new opportunities to enhance its power and influence. These ambitions, culminating in the Sicilian expedition, revealed the underlying reality that Athens viewed the peace not as a lasting settlement, but as a chance to regroup and strategize. This aggressive pursuit of expansion directly contradicted the spirit of the peace agreement and reignited Sparta's fears for Athens' dominance. Finally, the larger Greek political landscape, with its complex network of allies and rivalries, presented inherent challenges to the stability of any single agreement. While the Peace of Nicias sought to create a balance of power, the many city-states of Greece had competing interests that were difficult to reconcile. This network of alliances meant that even small conflicts or grievances could quickly escalate and undermine the peace. For instance, city-states like Argos and Corinth saw the alliance as an opportunity to maneuver for their own advantage, further destabilising the fragile peace. So, in conclusion, the Athenian-Spartan alliance of 421 BC, born out of the Peace of Nicias, faced numerous challenges that ultimately rendered it ineffective in securing a lasting peace. The profound mistrust between Athens and Sparta, conflicting strategic goals, pressure from unreliable allies, internal political divisions, difficulties in enforcing the treaty, and the persistence of Athenian imperial ambitions all contributed to the alliance's fragility. Rather than ending the Peloponnesian War, the peace proved to be a temporary reprieve that postponed the conflict. This period highlights the complexities and limitations of diplomacy in ancient Greece, where alliances were often tactical and temporary, and the underlying ambitions of powerful city-states made peace difficult to maintain. Now that we have looked at the articles that were set in place governing the peace, along with the issues and shortcomings, we will now continue the narrative of events after the Peace of Nicias had been established. In the following episodes, we will see how many of the issues we have discussed this episode would play out, and we will see step by step how the peace would be undermined, and eventually a state of war come back into place, continuing the Peloponnesian War. Thank you all for the support and continuing to support the series. It is greatly appreciated. I'd like to give an extra special thank you to all my Patreon Archon members. So a big shout out to Neil Bennett, Ali Ullman, Nick Kaplafakis, Paul Faminga Matthew, and John for choosing to support the series over on Patreon and supporting at the Archon level. If you've also found some value in the series and wish to support the show, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can find the link to Patreon, as well as many other ways to support the show. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. Once again, thanks for the support, and I hope you can join me next episode where we continue the narrative in the series.